So we will start, of course, with the land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I am presenting from the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So Indigenous people have been and continue to be stewards of lands across the world. And so I'd like to take this time to acknowledge how Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty are integral to Indigenous well-being and the well-being of our planet, and how Indigenous rights and sovereignty are integral to our collective climate story. So I think that's an important thing to consider when we're thinking about writing climate fiction, no matter who we are, and thinking about the sort of essentiality and the essentialness of Indigenous rights and sovereignty in that. And at this time, I'd love to hear from you as well, if you want to share where you're joining from in your own acknowledgement. And also if you want to share how you're feeling today, I'd love to hear that as well. I'll keep the chat open so I can see anything pop up in that way. In terms of myself, I'm feeling pretty happy. Yeah, but if you want to share, like if you're feeling excited or happy or, anxious or overwhelmed with thinking about writing climate fiction and what you want to learn today. So yeah, feel free to share anything like that. But yeah, I'm feeling pretty happy and excited to be here. Love to hear what other people are feeling as well. Well, Kaylee says, feeling excited and also a bit tired, long day. Yes, I totally get what you mean. It is a little late in the day, 5 p.m. Pacific time, and I know folks are joining in from all sorts of places as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, taking the time out of your day to learn about climate fiction. Awesome. Feeling a wee bit tired and excited for today's presentation. Awesome. Excited for the workshop. Thank you, Eliza and Nadine. Awesome. Okay, that's lovely. Oh, Megan. Yes, excited. Climate dreaming. I love that phrase. That's such a great way of thinking about this. Okay, I think you can keep putting your thoughts in the chat. Be welcome to hear more. I'm going to continue on with just a little introduction about me, who I am and what I do. So as you know, my name is Shalini. I work at UBC Press and I'm a climate fiction writer. So I wrote my first climate fiction story in 2007, and at that time I didn't know it, but I was really writing because of the 2004 tsunami that hit my homeland of Sri Lanka. And also at the same time, around within the same like year or two, Hurricane Katrina also hit the coast of the US, and seeing all of that on the news was very devastating as a young child. You know, you feel like your world is kind of crashing down around you when you see those things. So I think that's kind of where my climate impetus has come from, and I've been writing in climate fiction ever since and interested in stories in that way. I do have a master's in English literature that I completed at UBC. I did my thesis in specializing in criticism. So that is the study of how nature is portrayed in literature. So I specialize specifically in poetry written around the beginning of the industrial age, so in like the 19th century. So that's kind of like my educational background. In terms of climate action, I also volunteer with Dogwood BC, and I do some deep canvassing. If you haven't heard of deep canvassing before, that's basically you're out talking to people about climate and kind of getting a sense of what they think about climate, like whether they're really informed or not, like just having a talk about, the weather changing or how they feel about policies and that kind of thing. So that I think has really fed really into like being able to write authentic like climate feelings in my writing. So that's something that I'm interested in. Oh, and Charlotte says that she loves deep canvassing as well, which is great to hear. And yeah, I see some other people introducing themselves as well. That's wonderful. Yeah, so to continue on, I'm also working on a novel, which you will hear more about later on in the presentation. And yeah, and I also just want to mention that I am kind of a newbie in the scene. Like I'm not like, I wouldn't say I'm like an expert. I'm still continually learning, and I'm here with this workshop to kind of share some lessons learned and share my process with you. And so I'm also like equally really excited to hear like what you're doing, what you're working on, what's come through your mind when you're doing this work. So I would love to kind of build that community together, because I feel like I don't really have a climate writing community at this point. So it would be lovely to build up that together too. All right, so going into table of contents. So just quickly kind of giving a structure to our workshop today. So I'm going to do some presenting and just lead some discussion with you all for about an hour. And then we'll have some breakout session times, some time to do that in smaller groups and talk a little bit about a prompt in smaller groups. And then we'll come back together to share our learnings and then dive into a Q&A for about 10 minutes. So hopefully we can adhere to that schedule. And yeah, have a great time during it. Yes, so to outline what we're going to learn today, at least in the presentation section, and hopefully during the breakout sessions as well. I want to kind of guide you through a discussion on what is climate fiction and discuss why it's important and to identify some examples. And then having that as a base to investigate what makes good engaging climate fiction, and sharing my thoughts on it and hearing what you have to what you have learned as well. From there, I think that's a good basis for us to start understanding why you want to write climate fiction and how that can help you stay on track and keep motivated to keep writing, because it's really hard work to always be thinking about climate change, you know, and being in like that research mode or thinking in that way. So yeah, figuring out how to stay on track and self-care at the same time, I think that's an important thing, and hopefully something we'll discuss today. And then the last one, of course, connecting with other climate writers. So I'm excited to talk with you all a little bit later, and yeah, getting to know each other a bit more. All right, diving into what is climate fiction. So I have my own little definition here, and I'd love to hear from other folks too if you want to speak up or add it in the chat later on. But yeah, my sort of idea of climate fiction, which is a term coined by Dan Bloom, who's a journalist. Climate fiction is a growing and increasingly relevant genre and subgenres of storytelling in which implications of a climate that's changing impacts the nature of the story. So to me, this means that a changing climate is influencing the story's setting, its characters, the decisions they're making, and also the plot of the story. So climate change might be a big feature or like a backdrop to the story, and that completely varies depending on like, you know, what genre you're working in. And there's so many genres that you can apply climate fiction to. So that's really exciting to delve into as well. I think, for example, like people like to think that climate fiction is just speculative fiction, and I think that's increasingly not the case, because the effects of climate change are real, you know, and they have been real for a while. So when we are writing about the current effects, that might not be speculative anymore. So thinking about what genres fit into climate fiction is really interesting. I think what it does ultimately is engage the reader to think about their beliefs about climate change. And it also has that dual effect of leaving behind a legacy of thought during this unprecedented time. Like, how did we in 2023 think about climate change? It'll be there for readers in the future to see. And I think that's important for us to document in this time through our stories, whether it's like based in reality or otherwise. Yeah, and so you can see some examples here. I'll also note some of the subgenres as well, in case you haven't heard of them before, or maybe you do and you want to rep that genre. But other genres are also solar punk, hope punk, dystopian and utopian fiction, heterofiction, and intersectional futurisms like queer, indigenous, African, and disabled futurisms. So those are all part of the climate fiction umbrella or family, as you will. So I think some of those subgenres are represented here as well. So you can see some of the covers, perhaps they are familiar to you, like Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower, Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood, which is probably one of the first climate novels that I've ever read. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, The Nature of Witches, which is like a pretty recent book. And it's actually young adult, and it directly deals with climate fiction. So I'm really excited about that because I write in climate fiction, specifically in science fiction and fantasy. I write in, young adult. The Ones We're Meant to Find, as well as a young adult, which is awesome. Moon of the Encrusted Snow is great. Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. We'll come back to that one in a little bit, but yeah, Robinson is a noted climate fiction writer. Oh yeah, and Kaylee is mentioning that, yes, Broken Earth, 5th season, that's a great series as well. I also enjoyed it. Yeah, and then the last one here might be a bit of a curveball, yeah, which is Mary Shelley's The Last Man. And I think a lot of people know Mary Shelley from Frankenstein. She wrote Frankenstein at age 19, and it's considered one of the first science fiction novels and stories. And I think that I think it's a novella, The Last Man is one of the first iterations of climate fiction as well. So in The Last Man, it's actually very relevant to today, what's going on today. Basically, this is the documentation of the last man on Earth because everyone else has been wiped out due to a global pandemic. And so Mary Shelley's writing in the 19th century here. But basically, this is a documentation of how nature has taken over the earth and reclaimed it again. That's what The Last Man is about. So I would consider that climate fiction. So I think a lot of people have this idea that climate fiction is a new thing. I don't think so. I think climate fiction has been there ever since, we have seen how human society has affected the environment around us and has kind of taken control of the environment around us. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. And yeah, with that all said, if anyone has their own definitions or their favorite sci-fi books, if you want to share what you're working on right now, I'd love to hear that. If you want to, again, unmute yourself or add that to the chat, would love to hear anything you would like to add to the space. Oh yeah, Octavia's Brood. Yes, science fiction stories from social justice movements. Buffalo's the New Buffalo. I haven't heard that one, I don't think. And Uncrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Animals. Oh, interesting. Those sound really, really good. I'll have to add those to my reading list as well. Okay, I will continue on. If you want to add your thoughts as well, feel free to include those in the chat as we go. Yes. Great. Awesome. Okay, so diving into how do I start writing climate fiction? So this is a section where I'm going to kind of share my questions that I have that helped me kind of figure out my process of writing and figuring out why I'm writing what I am and how that's going to help me continue writing. And then at the end, if you want to publish your story, how to market your book as well, and having that all set up from the beginning, that's quite helpful. So yes, to continue on. These are some of the questions that I've asked myself. They're quite foundational, so you might have the answers already, but I think it's a good place to start. So why are you writing a climate story? What makes you passionate about it? What do you want your readers to feel or do after reading your work? What genres are you writing in or against? And what voices are integral to your story? So we're going to go through each of these questions one by one and kind of do a bit of discussion here and there. So yeah, look forward to that. Oh yes, and just before we go there, these are a set of sort of like beginner questions. I do a lot of yoga, so some of the yoga instructors I follow will do like, you know, the regular pose and then do like a modification for beginners who haven't done as much yet. So this is the modification list of questions. So if you're more of a reader rather than a writer, I think these are great ways to reframe those questions. So why do you want to write in this genre of climate fiction? What aspects make you excited and passionate about writing? How do you like to feel after reading climate fiction? Do you want to feel educated, contemplative, motivated? What genres do you like reading outside of climate fiction? And whose voices would you like to see elevated in today's stories? And adding on to that, how can you contribute to that? I see some more additions to the chat. That's lovely. Thank you for adding those in there. I'll have to note them down to add them to my reading list. Okay, so question one, why are you writing a climate story? So people might think that this is easy to stop climate change. Like that's why we're writing these stories. It's to raise awareness. It's to get people to think about climate change in a different way, in an urgent way. But I think it goes a bit more deeper than that for sure. And this is, and it's to do with identifying your passion and figuring out what is the story about, and it's usually going to be a story about you and your life experiences. So take your time with this idea. It's going to be hard to pin down and it will be ever evolving as well, but I think it's really important to figure out like, why are you writing your climate story? When I started writing back in like 2007, my idea was like, I want people to take action and to raise awareness and to stop climate change, you know, and that's kind of like an uncontrollable outcome, right? Like it's very hard to make readers do a certain thing just by reading your book. So figuring out exactly what your reason is, why do you want to create this story and put it out there? For me, that's to create a story that I can share that's about complex intersectional perspectives on living in a climate precarious world, to make young folks feel seen and understood, because I myself am writing in young adult. So those are the people that I want to reach. And I think I've actually missed a slide, so I'm going to go back. I think because my chat is open, I have to keep clicking. There we go. Okay, this will make more sense to why I have my answer written there on those slides. So yes, I wanted to give a baseline of my own climate fiction novel that I'm writing. So we can kind of go through these questions using it as a sort of a marker and go forward from there. So yeah, my novel is tentatively titled Unearth, and it's following a 17-year-old girl named Tara, who you can see pictured here. This is some artwork that I did of her. And so at the beginning of the story, Tara is 17 years old and she's just about to graduate high school. And she has to decide, okay, what am I going to major in? She knows that she wants to do something that will help stop climate change. She's worried about her future and her younger sister's future. And so she needs to make a decision. And she's like, you know, what can I do? Environmental management, energy policy, law, like no matter what I do, Tara feels like she is not going to make as much of an impact because she's just one person. And then she gets abducted by aliens. So that's where the story kicks off, and Tara is actually given magical powers, and she unearths this power within herself to control the element of earth. So with the help of the aliens, she has a decision to make, which is either help them create systems change on earth, like the way that folks are doing right now, or Tara can harness her magical powers and solve climate change in like the silver bullet way of, you know, I will take the gases out of the atmosphere, I will cleanse the earth of pollution. But by doing that, by going the magical route, the magic will take parts of her soul. So she'll have to sacrifice parts of herself to do this work. So really, it's a story about her making this decision and what leads up to that decision that she makes. And yeah, I think it's a story about climate anxiety and feeling as an individual like this responsibility to do as much as you can, and asking the questions of how much you can give of yourself that you can give up to solving climate issues. So that's a summary of my story. So we'll use that as sort of a baseline going through the rest of the questions. And yeah, feel free to, you know, write some notes down about these questions as we go. And, you know, this will hopefully be recorded and provided to you, so you can always go back as well and go through these questions again on your own time. Yes, okay, so we did question number 1, and now question number 2 is, what do you want your readers to feel or do after reading your work? So this is really a time to explore what your themes are, and what you want the readers to feel through your characters, and what your characters experience, what they are fighting for or through, and what they're learning and reflecting on through your story. And for me, this is really a space to think about what your story is doing and how it's doing it. So a lot of climate fiction, you will see here that I've written down didactic versus experiential. So for me, a lot of climate change fiction, or the perception of climate fiction, is that it's really didactic, right? Because I think it's a mistake that a lot of folks can do regardless of what genre you're writing in. But this idea of like, there's just one message that we're trying to portray, which is climate change is bad, right? And trying to hone that in for the readers and telling them that directly. To me, like when a book feels didactic, to me, that's when an author's voice is directly heard through the writing. Like you can hear the author speaking to you directly, and it's not the characters speaking to each other or whatever's happening in the scene. That I feel like tends to become more of a didactic situation. And to me, a story suffers when you can hear the author's voice coming through too much, rather than through the characters, because then it feels like the author is trying to tell you what to do or what to think in that situation. And it's not, you know, there are cases where you want to be didactic, like if you're like, you know, this is no time to be neutral in the situation of climate. You should pick a side, like the time is running out, that kind of thing. So it can be done, but for me, it's not as good to be didactic all the time, because telling people what they should do often, as I'm sure you know, often leads to them not doing that thing, or they're going to stop reading your work in that case, if it feels like that. So I think that that's something to think about in your work as you're going through. So yeah, that's, I think also like just in fiction in general, like this idea of showing versus telling, sometimes, and not all the times, you want to create an experience for the reader that shows people what's at stake. And that's through, you know, character interactions or whatever is going on in your story. But you need to be aware of when you're doing this and why. So in terms of answering this question, for me, I want my readers to feel seen in their climate anxiety, understand how we got here, and figure out the often conflicting complexities of diverse climate perspectives. I want them to read more stuff after reading my book as well. Like I want them to do more research. I want them to read more climate fiction. So that's something that is important to me. So figuring out what you want your readers to do will really help you figure out how you want to write your book or story. And now I would love it if you would indulge me on going back to my academic roots with some close reading. I did mention before we would revisit Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And I think close reading is a great way to show an example of when this works and when not doing a didactic thing works. So there's a scene that I'd love to share with you. Kaylee has dropped the link in the chat, so you can follow that to the passage, and we'll close read that together. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can go there myself and share that screen. All right. So this is an excerpt from Ministry for the Future, which is a book that was published in 2020. And I actually haven't finished this book, but this scene really caught my eye and was like, okay, this is like a good example of good, like character-driven climate fiction. So yeah, I'd love to share it with you. And then if you have any thoughts towards the end, please feel free to share that. And yeah, I will also note that this passage will contain mentions of post-traumatic stress, climate anxiety, and mentions of climate disaster. So if you can't engage with those topics right now, don't worry about it. You can skip this exercise, you can mute and just move away, and you can come back when you can see like leaves and flowers on the screen again. You can come back at that time. I'll also note that this scene contains mild spoilers for the book. So the context of this passage is that we follow Mary, who is the head of the Ministry for the Future, which is an international organization aimed to address climate change and other crises threatening future generations. She's currently being accosted in her own home by a man who has survived a heat wave and wants to confront her about what she's doing to stop further climate disaster. So this is kind of like a sort of bureaucratic woman being accosted in her own home by a man she doesn't know and who wants answers from her. So I'm going to read the passage out loud, and you can also follow along through the link that Kaylee sent out. I just find reading along while someone speaks helps me kind of massage the passage into my brain better. So here we go. He shook his head, glaring down at her. "That's why I'm doing this," he said, voice low and furious. "You do know. You only pretend not to know. You all pretend. You're the head of the United Nations Ministry for the Future, and yet you pretend not to know what the future is bringing down on us." "No one can know that," she said, meeting his eye. "And I have to say, the ministry is organized under the Paris Agreement. The UN isn't directly involved. You're the Ministry for the Future." "I lead it, yes." He looked at her silently for a long time. At some point in the inspection, still looking at her, he sat back down across from her. He leaned over the table toward her. "So," he said, "what do you and your ministry know about the future then?" "We can only model scenarios," she said. We track what has happened and graph trajectories and things we can measure, and then we postulate what the things we can measure will either stay the same or grow or shrink. Things like temperatures or birth rates or like that? Yes. So you know. I mean, in your exercises, is there any scenario whatsoever in which there won't be more heat waves that kills millions of people? Yes, she said. But she was troubled. This possibility that he was bringing up to her now was exactly what kept her up at night after night. Scenarios with good results, in which they managed to avoid more incidents of mass death, were in fact extremely rare. People would have to do things they were not doing. His presence in her kitchen was all too much like one of her insomniac whirlpools of thought, as if she had stumbled into one of her nightmares while still awake, so that she couldn't get out of it. "Ah," he cried, reading this off her face. She grimaced, trying to erase the look. "Come on," he said. You know the future." It sounded like he might hurt his voice. He was so intent to speak without shouting. He coughed, shook his head. "And yet you're not doing anything about it, even with your job." He stood again, went to her sink, took a glass out of the drainer, filled it from the tap, took a drink. He brought it with him back to the table, sat again. "We're doing what we can," she said. Okay, so that is the scene. I'd love to go into like a little discussion moment with you as well. I know that was like a lot to kind of ponder over, so feel free to take a few moments to think about this passage if you'd like. So I have some reflection questions here, but basically like anything you feel about this scene, what does it make you feel? What emotions come up? What do the characters make you feel? If there's parts that are engaging. I think we're going to pause the recording for a minute, but feel free to share what you think. I think I can see some people chatting, so, or not chatting, but typing, which is great. Okay, so we're back to the presentation. And yes, so from our discussion, we kind of discussed, how this very character focused scene kind of exemplifies the feelings that we have around climate change and what folks are going through, and sort of the unhealthy dynamics of people in different situations regarding to climate and having their mindsets being pitted against each other, how that creates like a really unsettling and engaging scene. So I would like to share my hypothesis about what makes good climate fiction. I think that character-driven climate stories can often be the most engaging, resonant, and memorable to read. That is just from my sort of experiences reading climate fiction. For example, that passage was one that really stood out to me. So I think that characters with different mindsets and opinions, when they're in conflict within a scene or across a story, can engage readers. 99% of the time when we want to write a story, the message or the moral of the story is the focus of climate fiction, right? What you want readers to take away from the story. But that doesn't have to mean that your story has to be didactic. So as we've seen here, the characters were sort of the medium for your message. They're the ones who are enacting the themes of your story. I think the most resonant climate stories do this. They embed the messages in the characters, in their identities, the decisions that they make during the story, and how they interact with other characters, and thus moving the plot forward. I think that's the most interesting to read, because I think when you break it down to like the most fundamental basics of storytelling, what we are here to see is someone a person or a being going through a conflict and seeing how they change, or the decisions that lead up to the decision that they have to make, and then how they change afterwards. So I think that principle remains the same with climate fiction. And yeah, so with characters who have these different mindsets and opinions, and you're just letting them talk or interact with other characters, you're raising questions and not answering them for readers, thus allowing readers to make up their own mind about climate change and their own attitudes towards it, thus making your story more impactful and relatable, because you're asking the reader to make up their own opinion. You can gently guide them to a particular conclusion, but this is sort of the way that I think leads to engaging climate fiction. So relating to relatability, the next question that we're going into is, what genres are you writing in or against? So this is actually a really important question to ask about your fiction, which is what are your genres that you're working in? Are you writing literary, science fiction, fantasy, horror, thriller? Any genre that's out there could probably fit into climate fiction somehow. And the reason why I like doing this is to understand not only what I like, but also what my readers are expecting. So then I can subvert those expectations or feed into those expectations, whatever you want to do. But understanding what genres you're in conversation with will help you understand, like, okay, what is the base level of what readers are expecting? What are the conversations that are happening with the books that are already existing out there? And then also, if you want to publish your book, marketability is a big thing. So in terms of the way that people, like readers, find books, keywords are really important. So figuring out what genres you're writing in will help you generate those keywords, and in fact are keywords themselves. And then, if you're publishing with a traditional publisher or self-publishing, and your book is on Amazon or website of a bookstore, those are going to be things that are going to help people when they're searching for books to read in climate fiction and other genres. And also, it's a great way to figure out, like, if there's a reader who doesn't necessarily read climate fiction, but they see like, oh, this is a thriller, I might enjoy that. That's a great way of figuring that out too. In terms of like my academic interests, I also like to reframe this question as, what stories or gaps of knowledge am I responding to with my work? So if you've ever written like a big paper or thesis or dissertation, you know that what you're doing is filling in gaps of knowledge within the conversation. So I think climate fiction, you know, even though it's been around for a long time, that gap of knowledge, like the gaps of knowledge are still quite vast, because I think not a lot of voices are represented in climate fiction. You know, it's obviously steadily increasing, and a lot of the foundational climate fiction is written by BIPOC authors. But there's still also like, you know, as we're trying to figure out like why people aren't acting on the climate crisis, and sort of the shift of this idea of like, if people just knew the information, we would change our ways, and that's not the case, right? So even that like gap of knowledge of why people aren't changing their behavior, or systems aren't changing their behavior, that is a gap of knowledge that's currently changing, right? And climate fiction is a great place to explore that gap of knowledge and to think about, hey, like, why is this the case? And kind of exploring that idea a bit further. I've also noted here the idea of data versus emotions. So I think any climate fiction book is probably going to be within a spectrum of how much of this is about the realities of climate fiction and how much of it is about the subjective emotions of climate fiction. So in terms of the data side, this could be like real solutions, real issues that people are facing in trying to solve climate. And then the emotions are more like, how are people feeling? What are the insomniac whirlpools that are happening in people's minds who are participating in this or not participating in climate action? So thinking about all of those, thinking about where in the spectrum that your book fits into. I know my mind is a mixture of those. And yeah, that's something that I think is a really important thing to think about, in terms of like how much research you want to do for your book. So if we do have this opportunity of perhaps doing a part 2 to this workshop. Let me know if that's something you're interested in at the end. But yeah, if we do a part 2, I am working on this template for figuring out my research for my climate novel. So trying to digest all of the, you know, climate news and research and reports that are coming out and making that digestible into like a short document that then I can refer to and think about like, oh, like what am I actually trying to say with my novel in terms of like if I want to include real life like research and data and that kind of thing. If your story is informed by the news and reports and things like that. So yeah, that's something that might come in the future. And just to round off this question, I will provide my answer for my book, which is the genres I'm writing in are young adult science fiction, because those are my favorite genres to read. And they're also really popular. And I want to have a large audience base for my books, not just because I want to sell a lot of books, but because I think that the story that I'm writing is for young adults who feel like they haven't had the chance to explore how they're feeling about climate change, whether they're informed about it or not. And I also know that my stories are romance, and that's a big part of young adult fiction today. So I want to play with romance tropes and the expectations and subversions of romance, and use that as a space to ask, what's it like to be in love during the climate crisis? What do feelings of responsibility do to a relationship, or forming a relationship, or ending one? So those are kind of interesting questions for me to think about. So I thought I'd share that with you as well. All right, and then on to the final question, which is what voices are integral to your story? And this is a really important question and something that I'm still working through myself. I think this is going to be a very long endeavor for anybody to be thinking about in terms of representation and how to do it well. So for me, I believe that climate change can only be solved if we tackle it on all fronts with multiple solutions at various levels. So that naturally means that the people involved in climate action are going to be diverse from different ethnicities, socioeconomic classes, sexual orientations, religious backgrounds, abilities, and disabilities. So thinking about all the people who are involved, you have to figure out which ones are the ones that are integral to your story. And a lot of them you might identify with, and some of them you might not identify with. So how do you go about incorporating those voices in an authentic way, regardless of whether you identify with them? Because there's no one expert or a person who represents a specific identity. So for me, approaching diverse representation in my work, I have to think back to my own intersectional identities. For me, I'll share this personal tidbit. For me, my main character, Kara, was actually a white character at the beginning, because that's what I had seen in young adult fiction, was white girls. And then as I learned more and kind of understood what my story was about, I changed her identity to other ethnicities that I believed were more integral to climate action and central to the story of climate change. And that wasn't a brown woman. And then more recently, I realized, like, hey, that's kind of weird that I don't think that a brown woman can be central to a story about climate action. And I think that was a real turning point for me to think about, like, what the sort of exclusionary feelings around environmentalism historically and climate action. You almost always only see like rich white people being interested in saving the environment, like in media and that kind of thing. Like what that has done to my own internalized beliefs about who is at the forefront of climate action. So for me, thinking about my own identities and interrogating that, like starting with yourself, is probably the best way to dive into this. It's probably going to be hard work, and you have to be kind to yourself, of course. But that's kind of one of the best ways that I've kind of figured out how to write an authentic identity, intersectional identities in my story. Yeah, and in terms of like issues that you might encounter or expect to encounter, even if you identify as one of the most, like, the whitest or straightest or most able-bodied person out there, you're going to have some unique social traits and life experiences that you can draw on and speak to others in your community, right? There's all sorts of ways to go through this, and that's by talking to people in those communities, to have sensitivity readers. I'm kind of exploring this idea of having like sensitivity, like almost consultants. So rather than just having sensitivity readers at the end who are going to read your book and provide some more insight to those specific representations, why not have those people in your process earlier on? You can discuss these things with them as you're trying to write them or develop your characters. And have that sort of dialogue from the beginning. So it's baked into your writing process rather than added on at the end. I think sensitivity readers are still really important and something that you should do, but I'm also thinking, like, why not have like people to consult with as well? And of course, regardless of who you're bringing into this conversation around your book, make sure that you're compensating them in an agreed way and that you're giving back to them as much as they're giving to you, because you shouldn't expect to be educated on diversity and representation by someone just because they're interested in your story or they're your friend or things like that. I see some hearts in the chat. Thank you. I'm glad that you identify with that. Yeah, so I think another important thing is to also, as I said, be kind to yourself and not expect to be perfect and to satisfy all readers. Something that I do that's not really that healthy is think about how, like, imagine a scenario where someone sends me a message saying, like, I didn't feel identified in your work, like your representation sucks or something like that. And I think about how I would respond to that, right? So I think that exercise helps me think about how I want to do my process, because I want to be able to respond to them with the following message in a way that I feel like it was true to my process. So something that I would say to this person is, I did my best to learn and represent your identity with the tools I had in my reach, with the support I have access to. I didn't expect it to be perfect because that is an impossible task. This was the best I could do at the time, and I'm constantly learning so I can do better next time. Thank you for trying my work, and I hope you find the representation you're looking for in your next read. So yeah, thinking about how much you can do in the space that you're given, because if you're trying to be educated in diverse representation for a specific, even for one identity, your book is going to come out like at the same time as governments who go carbon neutral, right? Like 2050. So it would take forever for you to do that, right? So thinking about how much you have right now that can help you support you to do the best that you can in terms of diverse representation is important. And yeah, something that you should think about from the beginning, but also not like beat yourself down upon either. There might be times where you do feel like, like, am I writing the right thing? And the best thing to do is just keep writing and have people look it over and do your best in that way. And make sure that it's coming from the heart, essentially. Yeah. So I think from here, I know that was a lot to go through. From here, I just want to check in if there's any questions that you have so far with all of that kind of fresh in your mind still. Right after this, we're going to go into the breakout sessions. So we're just at 5:58, so pretty much on time. So if you have any questions right now, feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute. Okay, so we've come into the breakout session time. So the prompt here, which is optional but encouraged, is to answer the question of why are you writing a climate story? So that's question number 1 that we went through. And Kaylee is going to include that question in the chat, as well as the other questions that we discussed today, in case you already have an answer to this or you want to dive into the other questions. So you can kind of do that as well. So yeah, just take 5 minutes during the breakout sessions to reflect on this question or the other questions, and then to share it within your group for 10 to 15 minutes. Then if you want to go, further, answer the other questions as well. And then, yeah, you can discuss those in the groups. And then also, if you want to come back and kind of share what you learned or share what your answer is to this prompt, that's wonderful. And yeah, and the recording will be paused during the breakout sessions, but we'll be returning when we're discussing. But if you want to have some time before the recording starts again, that will also be an option. So yeah, I think we'll break out into the breakout sessions now. Question is... Okay, so Eliza asked, what does your writing process look like? Well, if we're doing a part 2 of this workshop, then I think that would be the focus, is like the actual writing process of writing maybe a novel, or maybe figuring out like a storyboard for folks who are interested in sort of other aspects like video games, where it might be applicable. That would be great if you're interested in hearing more about that. But I'll say right here that my writing process really, to me, is when I feel creatively there, and even when I'm not, I'll just sit down and write what I can. And sometimes that's just the form of me with my phone, just like writing notes or like taking things down as I go. I also have an outline for my novel. As I mentioned, there's a research document that I have that includes a lot of the sort of real world things that I want to include. So I do have an outline, but I kind of write with that as just a guideline, and it's not really strict that I adhere towards it. But yeah, in terms of a like rigid structure, I don't really have one. In terms of a writing routine, I'd like to think of it more as a creative process. And so if I'm listening to music and thinking about my book, if I'm doing my artwork and I'm thinking about my book, I consider that part of my creative process for working on my story. So I hope that generally answers your question for now, and then we can explore that perhaps at a later date. And okay, awesome. That's great that there's some interest for part 2. Awesome. So yeah, I think there were some questions from the actual registration. which I think Kaylee, if kind enough to add those into the chat, but I also have them here, which I will go through in case it was a question that you asked. So one of the questions that was brought up was, which publication or press would I recommend for sending out our climate change related stories? Which is a great question and kind of beyond the scope of what we've discussed here. But I will just share my screen so I can show you a couple of websites of presses and magazines that are great for this. So Stelliform Press is a Stellar Ideas Earth Focused Stories publisher. They're a small publishing house, but they are almost completely focused on climate change and culture. So a lot of these books are climate fiction. I follow them on Instagram and they're really great. They actually recently posted a video from their own writing climate fiction workshops, which is really cool. So yeah, feel free to explore Stelliform. Then there's also, if you're more of a short story writer, Grist is a great one. I think so they do a short story competition, I think every year. So you can submit your short stories on climate fiction and, you might be selected for their magazine, which is really amazing. So yeah, a lot of their work is more speculative. So for this prompt, for example, it's imagining 2200. So yeah, that I find them really interesting too. And then if you're more in the spec fic area, Uncanny is a great science fiction fantasy magazine as well. So they're also a great, if you're in the spec fic area, recommend them for sure. A couple of other questions was, if we still have time, if people need to go, that's totally fine. Another question that came up is, what is the relationship between climate writing and eco-criticism? Is climate writing inherently and necessarily eco-critical? Whoever wrote this question, thank you so much, because now you're indulging my nerdy academic side as well. So I think eco-criticism is probably an inherent part of climate writing, just because the study of literature doesn't always have to do with the author's intentions, but it makes it easier that, if you're writing about climate or environment, it's easier to, if you're thinking about how nature is portrayed in a book, if the author has explicitly thought about that, right? So I think that is inherent, but I also think, books that are if it's also asking, is psychoanalyzing a thriller book, is that inherent to thriller, the thriller genre? And it's yes, but you can also psychoanalyze a children's picture book, right? So I think you can use the eco-critical lens for any sort of novel or any sort of story, really. And sometimes that's even more interesting, because then you see how people who are not consciously thinking about the environment are thinking about the environment. For example, in my thesis, I focused on Lord Byron's poetry and looked at how he forms eco-critical thoughts in his work. And he's not known as a nature poet at all in sort of the academic or popular spheres. He's more related to politics and social issues and that kind of thing. So it's also interesting to interrogate other genres that are outside of climate fiction with an eco-critical lens, because it helps us identify why is there a binary between culture and nature, between humans and the natural world. So yeah, thinking about that is very interesting. And then one more question, which was about how do you combine climate fiction with historical fiction? So this is a really interesting question, and I think a lot of people probably wouldn't think that climate change has a big history, or would be conducive for historical novel, because you usually think period pieces and that kind of thing. But we discussed earlier about Mary Shelley writing climate fiction. The first scientist to discover that greenhouse gases are heating up the atmosphere, specifically carbon dioxide, was in 1896, I believe. It was a physicist named Savant Arrhenius. He's a Swedish scientist. But yeah, 1892, or 1896, that is so long ago, over a century, because I think most people think oh, climate change has only been a thing for 3 decades. but there has been a history of how we got to this place. So thinking about like, if you want to write a historical climate fiction novel, which is amazing, and I want to read it, if you're one of the people who submitted this question, I think a great place to start is researching the history of climate change and how we got there. And yes, Megan, excellent quote from Mary Shelley. They knew, and they really did. I feel like, yeah, I think there is a history. There is like a trajectory and a history that you can follow in terms of what happened in society and politics and people's everyday lives. You know, like when Mary Shelley was alive, like the industrial age was just beginning, and people were worried, like, you know, our land is, especially in Britain, our land, which was once public, is now being privatized, and now, you know, people have sections of land that they're working on rather than being an owner of that land. They're now like just workers on that land. So these sort of issues have been around for a long time. So yeah, that was me kind of rambling on those questions. But yeah, if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to submit to the chat or ask now, feel free to do so. All right, so I think if everyone's questions have been answered, or if they're, you know, waiting on for part 2, I think that is a good place to end off our workshop. So I think this is where we will say goodbye, and also to say thank you so much for attending. I'm going to share my screen one final time so I can show you where you can reach me. So yeah, if you want to chat further, feel free to email me at shalini.n@hotmail.com. Yes, I still have a Hotmail. I also have a website, shalinicreates.com, where you can follow a bit more about my novel if you'd like. And I also have an Instagram where I'm sharing my artwork and other sort of creative ideas and writing process tidbits and tips and tricks and that kind of thing on Instagram at moonlit.wildhaired. The picture that you see here is one of the artworks that I did recently of 3 of my characters being in love. So that's something to look forward to in my Instagram. So thank you so much, everyone. And thanks again to UBC Climate Hub for hosting this session. It was absolutely wonderful getting to chat with you all. And yeah, please stay in touch. And I'd love to hear back from you about part 2. And yeah, stay tuned, because I think we'll probably do it. And yeah, I hope to see you then.
That would be great. I have so much to think about.
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
Thank
you so much, everyone. Yeah, and yeah, feel free to stick around if you want to chat for a bit or head out. And some people are providing more recommendations for books as well, which is incredible. I have to go through this chat again, but and get all those recommendations. But yes, thank you so much.